All right, good evening. Thank you so much for joining me for this webinar this evening, where we are going to be talking all about how your student can choose the right college path for them. That can look a variety of different ways. So we're going to take a kind of a deep dive into different pathways that are available and possible. With that said, just a reminder, this is being recorded. I'm going to send the recording along with a variety of other resources at some point tomorrow. So you'll have access to this kind of for the long run. And that is not the only necessarily time that, or sorry, this is not the only time that you can ask questions. There is a lot of Q&A throughout, but if you watch the recording later or you're perusing through the resources later or anything like that, please reach out to me at any point, and I'd be happy to chat, follow up via email, have a Zoom meeting, whatever is best for your family. And then just an FYI, when you log out of this meeting today, you'll have a little pop-up from your internet browser that will take you to a feedback survey that should only take you maybe 45 seconds or less than a minute to complete. So I would love that, just to make sure that I am meeting all your needs and all the fun stuff. With that said, my name is Elise Kramer. I'm so grateful to spend the evening with you all. That is my direct contact information. So again, if at any point you have questions at 4 in the morning or whenever it may be, please reach out, and I want to make sure that we get all of your questions and needs answered. Before we jump in, I want to make sure that I kind of give a little bit of clarification on IN, which is the nonprofit that I work for. It gets a little bit confusing and a little bit muddled. So I want to make sure that kind of the difference of who we are versus the different college programs is clarified right off the jump. So IN is a nonprofit. We are about 10 years old. We were created by a group of parents who at that time looked around and said, most other states have inclusive higher ed, but we don't. And so we were kind of formed initially to create programs, but now we serve in the capacity of a lot of this type of work, where we're doing education and outreach with families. We're working to continually expand inclusive higher ed across the state. And then we also track outcomes for our graduates. With that said, we don't directly serve students on campuses. There are 8 campuses in the state that do that, and I will be doing a deep dive into those 8 throughout this next hour or so. But just to kind of clarify that, I don't personally provide services to students, but I work with a lot of great people who do. So just to make sure that's kind of clear right off the bat. I know this agenda doesn't look all that full, but trust me, it is. I had to actually cut quite a bit out to keep this in an hour. So I hope you forgive me if I'm speaking fast and kind of skipping through some things just to make sure we fit it all in. With that said, I want to make sure you get all your questions answered. So you don't have to wait for the Q&A portions, which are placed at the end of each of these sections. If you just want to get your question in before you forget it, you are welcome to type it in the chat at any point or raise your hand. And I'm happy to get all of your questions answered. With that, let's jump right in to the history of disability services and kind of the outline for the rest of the hour. So there's a lot on the slide, just to warn you ahead of time before I put it up there. I'm not going through the whole slide. What I really kind of want to draw your attention to are just a handful of things. So 1973 is when the federal government said universities cannot discriminate against students just because they have a disability. 1990, with the passage of the ADA, is when the federal government said, and you have to reasonably accommodate for those disabilities on your campuses. It wasn't until 2008 that those campuses were allowed to, but not required to, allowed to, serve students with intellectual disability. Again, not a requirement, but schools all over the country started doing just that. They thought, yep, we really want to serve as many students as possible. And in 2016, Colorado was the last of 3 states to have jumped on that bandwagon. And so our state legislature passed an initial bill to provide some seed funding for 3 initial pilot schools to start some inclusive higher ed programs and just sort of see how it goes. In 2022, after a lot of data that it was going really well, they provided more funding for additional schools to jump on board, and we are now at 8 schools. So that's kind of the really sort of brief summary of the history of disability services in the US. Now, as I go through the different levels of support, I want you to kind of think about this pyramid, and we'll keep coming back to this particular visual. But there's sort of different levels that kind of stack on top of each other. So the sort of basic level of services, those are more traditional disability services. Those are those basic accommodations that the ADA requires. Maybe that's not enough for your kid. And so then you have those regular services, and then we add on top some additional supplemental, some wraparound services. And maybe if that's still not enough, the tip of that pyramid is where inclusive higher ed comes in to provide all of the services then below it as well. Now, as I mentioned, you will get this PowerPoint tomorrow. And when you do, I encourage you to look through these bullet points with your student, maybe with your student's teacher, to kind of figure out which area your kid might fall in or you might fall in if you are the student. For now, I just want you to see that this is here. There is a checklist here for you to kind of go through, but I'm going to talk through each of these sections in much more depth as we go through. So I'm going to skip the content of the slide, but wanted it to be there for you to see it and kind of understand what it is. All right, so jumping right into traditional disability services. This is that bottom portion of our services pyramid. This is legally mandated at every single institution of higher education, whether it's a 2-year school, a 4-year school, a trade school, etc. This is part of the Americans with Disabilities Act, that ADA. Every single campus has to have these types of services. At a really big campus, it's probably going to be an entire office. At a smaller campus, it might only be 1 or 2 personnel. At a really small campus, it might even be one person who maybe half the time does work in the disability office and maybe half the time works in like Res Life or works in the athletic department or something like that. So it's not even always a full-time staff member. So that's something to keep in mind. And typically that correlates to the size of the school, although not 100% of the time. It's just something to keep in mind that you might need to be a bit patient when you're getting in contact with whoever that person is, because they may have quite a bit of students to serve or a variety of roles to serve just as one person. So just to keep that in mind. These are offices that serve a huge variety of disabilities. That could be anything from a physical disability to a chronic health disability to autism to ADHD to a mental health disability to you name it. So they provide accommodations that aren't just academic. They might be providing accommodations for someone who needs to live in a dorm on the first floor because they can't climb stairs if they need an accessibility accommodation, right? So they serve a wide variety of documented disabilities, and that includes individual students with a wide variety of documented disabilities as well. Now, the key thing to keep in mind, if you are seeking traditional disability services, you would be a student who would apply to the admissions office on campus. That means you would complete all of the required, it might be an essay, it might be submitting test scores like an ACT or an SAT, it might be submitting your high school transcript, letters of recommendation, right? You're going through the sometimes pretty strenuous and rigorous process of applying to college so that you can graduate with an associate's or a bachelor's degree at the end of it. These offices do also serve students at higher levels too, master's, PhD, etc. But we're going to assume that all of us are in high school and seeking the next step. So these are students who have to meet the essential functions of the course. And really, that's a fancy way of saying on the first day of class, when professors hand out a syllabus and they say, here's all the assignments you have to do this semester, here's all the learning targets you have to meet this semester, these students can meet all of those requirements as laid out in the syllabus so that they are working towards that degree, whatever that degree is, at the end of their time on campus. So they receive accommodations only. That's it, only accommodations. And you might be thinking, great, I know that word. I hear that a lot in my student's 504 meeting or my student's IEP meeting, but sometimes the words accommodations and modifications are used kind of interchangeably, and they technically are not the same. So I'm going to do an explanation here of accommodations. Later on, I'll do a deeper explanation of modifications. But right now, we're thinking traditional disability services, all they provide are accommodations. And what that means is there is no alteration to what a student learns. The only change is how a student learns or how a student indicates to their professor that they have shown their learning. And so that could be, you see this graphic here with a variety of examples, right? That could be audiobooks instead of physically reading the words on the page. That could be you're doing speech to text or text to speech, right? So there's a variety of different types of accommodations that might work in a classroom setting. There also might be different accommodations that try to prepare students for a workforce. And really why is because when you're hired for a job, you're expected to meet all of the things that the job description says. And if you can't do that, they're probably going to hire someone else who can meet all of the requirements on the job description. So all workplaces are required to provide reasonable accommodations as well. So that might be you get a standing desk if sitting for too long makes your legs start to hurt, for example, right? There are some accommodations that are reasonable in a workforce, but they are not going to modify the job description for any employee. They would just hire someone else. And so that's kind of where this understanding of accommodations comes in a college setting. We're really trying to prepare students to meet the requirements of the course, helping them do that in the way that works best, but they're showing the same depth and breadth of learning. There are a wide variety of accommodations that students can receive. I've already mentioned some in the classroom. There might also be some testing accommodations. So perhaps a student would go to a testing center on campus where maybe they have someone read the questions aloud to them, or maybe they're just in their own private cubicle or cubby so that they're not getting distracted. So testing accommodations sometimes include technology, sometimes they don't. As I already mentioned, an example of housing accommodations, those are pretty common for people with physical disabilities on campuses. And really the key thing to remember of all of these is when you look at the list of accommodations that your student or you receive in high school, so when you look through that 504 plan or you look through that IEP and you look at, I get accommodation X and accommodation Y and accommodation Z. It is not required for a college campus to automatically take those accommodations and put them in place in college. They might say, yeah, we can do X and Y, but we just can't do Z because we think that is altering altering what you're learning and not how you're learning it. So there's not always a direct connection from high school to college. Typically they're similar, but they're not exact, and there is nothing guaranteed. It can even change from college campus to college campus. One campus might perceive a set of accommodations as reasonable. Maybe you transfer, and another college says, actually, we disagree. That's not reasonable. So there is a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of perception kind of at play, and that's something to keep in mind for both accommodations and modifications, but particularly accommodations is where that tends to have the most kind of questions around it. Okay, so let's say you're thinking through this and you go, yep, I am a student who would access traditional disability services. That's my path. How do I get there? So the first thing you do after you're accepted into the university or the college is you have to self-disclose or self-advocate. No one knows that you have a disability. It is not part of the application process for a traditional college admissions. So you have to go or call or chat or whatever it is, the Disability Services office, and you have to tell them that you need accommodations for your disability. And they are going to say, great, give us proof. What that documentation is that proves that disability will change from campus to campus. Some are a bit more lenient with what they will accept, and some are much more particular, that they will only take X, Y, and Z. So don't just assume that yes, you have something, it should be enough. Sometimes it has to be in the last 3 years. Sometimes it has to be in the last 6 months. So they all vary. And that's something that it's important to keep in mind and make sure you ask when you self-advocate, when you self-disclose, ask the office, what do I need to bring to prove that I have a disability and therefore need accommodations? The diagnosis has to be clearly stated, and an IEP or a 504 is not often enough. Occasionally it is, but I would say more often than not, they want medical documentation from a doctor or some sort of educational therapist or someone who has had a bit more recent evaluation of the medical diagnosis at hand. Then the student will go through a really interactive process where y'all sit down with the office staff member and you will say, in high school, I got X and it didn't really help. I got Y and it was really helpful. And you'll kind of have a dialogue to figure out what exact accommodations are helpful at the college level. And so you'll talk about what are your needs with the kind of relationship between your educational needs and your disability. So if that's not a conversation your student is used to having, no matter what their disability is, I would recommend having that conversation now, practicing it, giving some key maybe phrases to use so that that's not an uncomfortable conversation when it is a necessary conversation. And then they will help you identify what they deem to be appropriate accommodations based on what they learned in the conversation. And then you will get a brand new letter of accommodation. There is not an IEP in college. There's not a 504 plan in college. Yes, those documents can help inform the creation of the new document, but it is a brand new letter. And even if you transfer from one campus to another campus or one university to another university, you will have to get a brand new letter there. So this process does vary a little bit across every single school, and pretty much nothing transfers. I'm asked that question a lot from families who say, does it transfer? No, not automatically. So that's something to keep in mind too. And then let's say you go through that whole process, but you never tell your professors that you have an accommodation letter. They will never know. The Disability Service Office does not reach out to professors and say, hey, you have Johnny in this class with ADHD and Marcy in that class with autism. The professors don't get any kind of automatic knowledge. Everything is on the student to bring that letter to professors on the first day of class and say, hi, I have this letter of accommodation. And so these are the different services and supports I need. With that said, that letter of accommodation does not say the nature of the disability. Nowhere does it say this is to help ADHD or this is to help autism, right? It just says these are the accommodations that have been approved. That's it. So if the student does not want to share their disability with their professors, they don't have to. But if they want accommodations from that class, then they do have to self-disclose what those approved accommodations are. So just a handful of things to note before we go on is that length of time to go through that whole process of providing the documentation and having that interactive conversation, it really varies. If it's a giant campus with a 20-person staff, it's going to take a different amount of time than if it's a small campus with someone who has 3 different types of offices that they work in and only one of them is the disability office, right? So it's important as soon as you're accepted to college to reach out to that office and just ask, how soon before the first day of school should I begin this process? Sometimes they'll say a month, sometimes they'll say 2 weeks, sometimes they'll say we already have a time set up during your orientation for that. But it's important to know what that is so that you are ready and prepared whenever that first day of class comes. And then it's on you to maintain open communication with those staff members. So if accommodations aren't working for whatever reason, no one is going to tell the staff that it's not working if you don't. So it's on the students to keep self-advocating and keep those conversations open. If they need accommodations from a professor, it's a really good idea to continually advocate for those accommodations in class. To say to a professor, hey, I know we have a test next week. What does that look like? How can I get those accommodations, right? Just to remind everybody has a lot going on. It's really hard to keep track, especially if you're a professor of a big lecture with maybe 200 students. It's going to be hard to keep track of who needs what and when and what class and all that kind of stuff. So it's important for students to continually be their own advocates. And then they're going to have to follow various procedures, which do vary on different campuses. So a lot of times testing centers, you have to make an appointment or make a request to take a test at a certain time. Sometimes that can take quite a bit of time in advance just because they can book up. Some professors are kind of like, I get it. You can take the test anytime in maybe this 2-day span, whenever you can get an appointment. Some are very much like, nope, you have to take the test during the class time. You're just taking it in a different location. And so that is all kind of things to keep in mind too. The more kind of locked into a time you need to be, the more time in advance you should give yourself to make that happen. So that was a lot so far. Before we keep going, does anyone have any questions on traditional disability services, the basic accommodations office on campus? All right. And the other thing I will mention is that the name of that office really varies across campuses. Sometimes it's called Disability Services, sometimes it's called the Access Office. It depends. If you go to the university's website and you just type in like disability or accessibility, it should come right up. All right, let's chug along. If anyone has any other questions, put them in their chat and I will get to them. All right, whoop, hold on, skipped ahead. Here we go. Okay, supplemental services. So let's say you have a student who wants that very traditional degree. You are confident that they can get an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree, even if it's maybe a slower time period. Maybe they're doing it in 5 years instead of 4, or 3 years instead of 2, or maybe it's even 4 years instead of 2, right? But you know that that's kind of the path they want to go, but those disability services alone are maybe not going to be enough. Then we're going to stack another layer onto our pyramid. Now, these services, as you'll come to see in the next few slides, are all widely different. There's not truly a name for them. For the purposes of this webinar, we're calling them supplemental services. Sometimes they're called wraparound services. But you'll kind of see that they are all different and therefore can't necessarily all be categorized together. We're just kind of putting them together for the purposes of, if the bottom layer isn't enough, what's next? So with that said, these are students who will access those traditional disability services. They will go to the office, they'll get their letter of accommodation, they'll bring those letters to their professors, right? All of that is going to remain the same. So as a reminder, these are traditionally admitted students. At the end of their 4 years or 2 years or whatever it is, they will earn a degree and they have to meet all of those essential functions. Everything written in that syllabus, students will be able to master by the end of their time in college with accommodations. However, if that's not enough, there are organizations, or sometimes it's universities themselves, have separate offices that will provide additional services in areas like academic coaching, or maybe they have some sort of peer mentoring or some kind of supported skill development. And that can take a variety of forms. These are just a handful. Maybe it's social skill development or executive functioning development, or working on goal setting, right? These are often, but not always, it can be a wide variety of students, but often the students who fall in this category are students with autism, and that tends to be the #1 diagnosis category that families ask me about if I don't really know where my kid fits. Almost always, again, not always, but quite often, those are students with autism who can meet the academic rigor of a traditional college path, but maybe they just need something else, someone to kind of keep them on track so that they're turning in their assignments. Pardon me. Even if they're turning in their assignments in an extended time period, they have longer to complete their things. They still have a deadline they have to meet, right? So who's going to help them do that? And so that's kind of where some of these additional types of services come in, but they do vary really widely. Every single program has their own fee structure depending on what types of services they are offering, how many hours of services, all kinds of stuff. They're pretty much always for a fee, as were that bottom portion of this pyramid. Those services, the basic accommodation services, have to be provided for free. These don't have to be provided for free because legally they don't have to be provided at all, which is why often there are external or private organizations that are serving those types of roles. So in Colorado, just to fit it all on one slide, here's just a few examples. Within some universities, CSU has the Opportunities for Post-Secondary Success, or OPS program. DU has LEAP, which is their learning effectiveness program. MSU Denver actually has two. They have the integrated supports for students with ASD in college, which they call Isaac. And then there's also the Inclusive Higher Education Solutions Office, which offers academic coaching. And then externally, some examples are Untapped Learning, which provides executive functioning support all the way down through middle school. So if you have a student who's looking for an executive functioning coach now, Untapped might be a great resource. And then College Living Experience really focuses on helping students with their independent living skills. And a lot of the executive functioning that comes around when mom and dad are no longer there to remind you to pick up your clothes and do your laundry and load the dishwasher and all that kind of stuff. So there's independent living support offered at some campuses through College Living Experience. But again, each of these have a widely different fee structure. One might be great for your kid, one might be horrible for your kid. It's all just about who you are and what you're looking for. And sometimes it's also about what you can afford as a family. So these are all things that I encourage you to look into on your own as you kind of go through if you think that this supplemental services section of the pyramid is going to be best for you or for your student. With that said, questions can I answer so far? And anything goes, no bad questions. All right, I'm going to assume that means nothing so far, but if you have anything, the chat is your friend. Okay, so most of you, if you're on this call, maybe not all of you, but I assume most of us are here to learn more about inclusive higher education. So that is going to be the really tip top of the pyramid. This is only offered at some schools. This is not legally required to be offered at schools across the United States. So only some do, and that's where I will go into a deep dive of the Colorado ones here throughout the rest of the section. But even before we do that, just to kind of understand how inclusive higher ed works. This is an alternative admissions pathway intended for students with intellectual disability and or students with other disability categories that mean they need modifications to be successful in college. So just to kind of clarify what I mean by alternative admission pathway, these students don't even apply through the Office of Admission. They apply directly through the inclusive office on the campus because they are submitting quite different documentation and different types of things to as part of their application packet. So there's no expectation that these students maybe even have a high school diploma. They might have a certificate of completion, and that's perfectly okay. These students maybe were not accessing the traditional curriculum in high school. If they were using extended evidence outcomes, that's quite common. Often these are not students who took the ACT or the SAT, right? Maybe they were in pass-fail courses, and so their GPA is not going to be looked at as rigorously. So the whole admissions process is quite different. Now, with that said, once students are accepted, this is not a segregated special education program that happens to be located on a college campus. These are fully enrolled college students. They are taking courses with the same professors and the same peers as everybody else on campus. Not only are their courses inclusive, all of their campus participation is quite inclusive. And so they're joining clubs. We've had students join Greek life and sports and all kinds of different things to really make sure that they are as included in their campuses as possible. These are students that access both accommodations and modifications, which I'll go over here in a few slides as the kind of deep dive into modifications, which we already did the accommodations, but really to kind of tease out what the difference is there. And as a result of those modifications, they earn a certificate at the end of their time in college. So if you think that you or your student at the end of college could get a degree, again, even if it's slower or you're taking fewer courses in a semester or it's supported in a variety of ways, then one of the other two paths I already mentioned would be a better path. If you think that you or your student probably could not access a traditional college curriculum without modifications, this will be their best path. Just know that at the end of it, they get a certificate rather than a degree. Now, it's important to know that these all have program fees. They vary widely Typically, they follow the same kind of model as tuition will follow. And what I mean by that is a community college is going to be cheaper than a four-year private school, and a four-year public school will be somewhere in the middle. So those program fees tend to kind of follow that same typical model of what we think about for cost of college. Now, students get a lot of support from staff on campus and also from peer mentors. So there is not a paraprofessional who's sitting in class with them or going with them to a football game, right? It's not an adult. It's another college student who has applied for a job and has been vetted and trained on how to support our students in inclusive higher ed to make sure that they're getting the most out of their college experience in all four areas of academics, social development, career development, and independence. So just to give a really, really quick summary of each of these areas, academically, peer mentors might meet with them before class to review material. During class, maybe they're helping them take notes or stay on track or work on a group project. After class, maybe they're meeting up to do homework or study for a test. Maybe they want a peer mentor to go with them to professors' office hours. Wide variety of ways that peer mentors will support them there. All along the way, they are earning grades. They have a transcript, so everything is for credit. That is not true in other states, but in Colorado, every single inclusive higher ed student is fully enrolled, working towards their graduation requirements. For social involvement, students are pretty much at every campus required to be involved in some way. They do that differently depending on the campuses. So some schools require students to be engaged in so many events per week or per month. Other schools just kind of say, like, pick something and we trust you that you're going to do it. Join the club every single week or whatever it is. For career, there is a career coach on every campus that will help students do a lot of career exploration, figuring out what they want to do, why they want to do that. All of their courses, or I should say many of their courses, will align with their career goals so that they are learning the hard skills they need to be employed in their areas of interest. And then all along the way, they have jobs and internships, both in and out of their fields, so that they're learning valuable career skills like showing up on time and clocking in and how to communicate with your boss when you're sick and can't show up. But then also things like, you know what, I worked in the daycare on my campus for 3 days and I hated it. And so I decided maybe I don't want to work with kids anymore. Let's switch my career goal, right? So all of their kinds of jobs and internships have a wide variety of purposes. And if needed, peer mentors can attend those things with students as well. And then in terms of independence, I have not yet met a single inclusive higher ed college student who has not told me that they have become more independent. That is true of students who live on campus. That is also true of students who live at home and commute. There is just a higher level of independence that is required in college. And that comes out in students' needs to self-advocate to their professors and to their peers. It also comes out in the getting yourself from this building onto the bus all the way across campus to get to that building for your next class. So there's a wide variety of ways that independence skills are formed, even if, and sometimes especially if, students don't live on campus. So with that said, just as a basic reminder, accommodations change how learning is shown, but the ultimate learning targets don't change at all. A modification changes what learning occurs. So if a professor says the class has 1 week to write a 5-page paper, an accommodation might be you have 2 weeks, but you're still writing a 5-page paper. The modification will say, okay, 5-page paper is going to be quite challenging. So what can you do? How can you show your learning? So maybe it's a 5-paragraph paper, or maybe it's a 5-slide slideshow where students can put in all kinds of pictures and graphics to show their learning. Maybe it's a student just recording a video of themselves, explaining everything they've learned and submitting that, right? So the actual what, the depth and breadth of a student's learning does change so that the course expectations are adapted to meet each individual student's cognitive level. And that is truly very individualized. So there might be two students who are in the same course and they're both inclusive higher ed students, but they could have wildly different modifications because their own needs and skills vary from each other. So this is not a one-size-fits-all model by any means. As much as possible, everything is person-driven. With that said, if I think of some of my professors I had in college, they might have been really great experts in their field. My biology professor was a great expert in biology, right? But if someone had gone to her and said, modify your curriculum, she would have no idea what to do because she's probably never had a background in special education. So there are program staff who are in charge of students' academics, who make all the modifications for them. They'll provide professors with rubrics so that they're grading students fairly against their own work, right, with a rubric that fits the work that meets their personal course expectations and all that kind of stuff. And then there are a variety of examples of modifications that students might get, but again, they're all very individualized. So in a classroom setting, that might mean students are doing shorter assignments, or maybe they're completing a graphic organizer as they're taking notes in class so that they're not free taking notes. Maybe they have some kind of help or support with that. For testing, maybe they have fewer questions or some type of simplified questions, or maybe it's an alternate format entirely. Maybe instead of doing a multiple choice test, a student is going into office hours and just kind of talking to a professor through what they think they learned in a unit. In housing, they might have additional support from RAs or from mentors, right? These are going to be things that are not typically provided if a student only has accommodations. With that said, I'm going to go through, so that was kind of the general model of inclusive higher ed in the state. I'm now going to go through each of the 8 options across Colorado so that if you think inclusive higher ed is right for you or right for your kid, this will help you start to tease out which of these 8 options is going to be the best for you. Now, one might be really great for someone else and might be horrible for you. None of these is better or worse than any of the others. It's all about what is the right fit for each individual and knowing that we all have different wants and needs and hopes and dreams and all kinds of things like that. So we're just going to go in alphabetical order. Arapahoe Community College has the Elevate program in Littleton. That is a 3-year, typically our community college offerings are 3 years long. And that is a commuter campus for absolutely everybody. So you have to get your way to campus. Lots and lots of students take the RTD. There are 2 close bus routes and a really close light rail station. Some students also take Access-a-Ride if they qualify. Quite a few students Uber. Some students have their parents drive them. A handful of students drive themselves. Either way, you got to get yourself into Littleton. Now, at ACC as a whole, as a community college, and this is pretty common for community colleges, their class sizes are pretty small. The average class size there is 25. You're just not going to find like a 500-person lecture hall at ACC. In fact, I'm in that building often. They don't have one. That does not exist. And so having small classes really helps ensure that students get to interact with their instructors and with other students in pretty authentic and meaningful ways. And that is something that I often hear from ACC professors. Every year we do a big evaluation of our students and our grads and their instructors and all kinds of different people. And almost always instructors at ACC will say something like, these students really contributed to the richness of our discussions in our class. And they get to do that because their classes are so small. And so that's something to keep in mind. Now, typically in inclusive higher ed, students will take 3 courses per semester. That can vary depending on the semester, but as a whole, it's about 9 credits. So it's typically 6 credits or 2 courses in their areas of study, and then they'll have 1 course that trains students specifically in a variety of skills necessary for students with ID. So at ACC, they call that that course, that secondary course, they call that their Elevate workshop. And that's really where they focus on independent living skills or financial literacy skills, healthy friendships and relationships, nutrition, all kinds of different skills. What is unique at ACC is that that course is free. And the way they get to do that is they don't have students register for it. So it does not show up on their transcript when they graduate. However, it is a graduation requirement. So if they're not showing up to those courses and all that kind of stuff, then they won't graduate on time until they repeat all of that. So that's how they get around giving you, as a family, cheaper tuition. That while your student is taking the academic kind of rigor of 9 courses, you're only paying for typically it's 6 courses. So that's a really exciting benefit of ACC. They have a lot of social and community engagement opportunities with students joining their national societies and their student government association. A few years ago, students created what they called the Elevate Club, which kind of within that had some shoot-offs. They have a unified gaming club and a creative art club and a sports club and a dance club and all kinds of different things where students can engage in kind of their interests in their own authentic ways. And then it's walking distance. If you don't know where ACC is, it's right in the heart of downtown Littleton. So students are all the time walking off campus and going to restaurants and coffee shops. And they're just really, really engaged with their community, where there is this really clear symbiosis between the living and the learning kind of aspects of the academics and the social and the community. And all of it is really well kind of melded together, which is very typical of a community college. Now, CSU just last school year officially launched the Rams Scholars program. And because it's so new, they don't have residential living yet. They really want to make sure that they get the academic pieces and the independence pieces very well supported and kind of make that a well-oiled machine before they take on an additional piece of residential living. So that will come, but not yet, which means for now, this is pretty much only open to students in the Fort Collins-ish area or close enough for daily transportation. Now, this is a really unique program in that it is fully geared towards career and technical skills for plant and animal sciences, and then related STEM for agriculture. So if you have a student who's really interested in learning about agriculturally related careers, maybe they're really interested in horticulture or animal husbandry or those types of things, this would be a really, really great program for them. Everything is really focused on experiential learning, on getting students the professional skills they need so that when they graduate, they can get a job in agriculture and they know what the heck they're doing. So if your student does not have an interest in one of those areas, this is probably not the program for them. All of their peer mentors come from these main areas. So that's human development and family studies, occupational therapy, and then agriculture education. So these are the students at CSU who are training to be teachers of ag in a K-12 setting. And so all of their peer mentors are already kind of geared in some way or another to work with them, whether it's in the content or working with them developmentally or whatever that looks like. So while they are trained by RAM scholars, they already kind of have that academic background, which they have seen really great success with. And then they take classes in 3 main locations. So the most obvious one is the CSU main campus right in Fort Collins. The second one is what they call RDEC, which is it's a working farm that CSU owns just north of Fort Collins. And I went there once and students were in a wood shop building themselves stools so that when the farm opened back up, that was in, I think, January, it was winter, it was very cold. So they were building themselves stools so that when the farm opened back up in the springtime, they had something to sit on while they were working on milking cows. And so everything is super technical, very hands-on, very experiential, super awesome. And CSU has a smaller campus in kind of west of their main campus called their Foothills campus. So if students get themselves to the main campus, the rest of the transportation to the various sites is coordinated, but they've got to be able to get at least to the main campus of CSU. This school year, Lamar Community College opened the Cultivate program. If you don't know where Lamar is, it is in the southwest corner of Colorado. It's a pretty small town in Prowers County where they're serving a lot of students from Colorado, but also from Oklahoma and from Kansas, because it's kind of in that corner where all 3 states come together. Now, as a community college, they do have residential living because they're so remote. They kind of have to have a place for their students to live. But like CSU, it's not open yet until they kind of get the rest of it figured out. So that will come eventually. For now, students have to have transportation. This is for the next few years, likely only going to be an option for you if you live in Southeast Colorado. But it does ensure rural access to inclusive higher ed, which is something that we hadn't really had before LCC jumped on board. So that is a really exciting addition. As I mentioned with ACC, the traditional community college model for inclusive higher ed is 3 years long, and they really emphasize the employment needs in their region. So they're preparing students to be like paraeducators in schools or working in agriculture or a lot of jobs that really prepare them directly for the workforce in their area. And like ACC and like most community colleges, it is a very community-oriented campus culture. However, Lamar is such a small town that the whole town kind of revolves around the school. And so it's even more community oriented perhaps than any other campus, just that the school and the community are kind of one big conglomeration of each other. And so they have that town gown feel, which is a bit exciting. MSU Denver has the kind of bigger office is Inclusive Higher Education Solutions. That office has a continuum of supports for a wide variety of students with disabilities. Within that continuum, they have Inclusive Support Services, or ISS, which is their inclusive higher education option. MSU Denver is a commuter campus. Some people don't know that, but it is a commuter campus for everybody. However, it is right on the light rail. There's 2 different light rail lines, quite a lot of bus options, also Uber, RTD, all that kind of stuff. What's really exciting about students living at home is that they get to what we call learn and earn in their home community, meaning when they graduate, they will already have been practicing the skills that they need post-grad in the environment in which they will most likely live. And so for some people, they say, I really want to go somewhere where I can live on campus. And that's great. I respect that. I understand that. I think that is an awesome goal and desire and want. And if that's not what you want, there's a benefit to that too. Now, I had mentioned that at all schools, they have typically, it's 9 credits a semester, where it's 2 classes in their career path and then 1 class for students with ID, or that additional class is typically only for the students in inclusive higher ed so that they can get really targeted specific instruction in a variety of skills. At MSU Denver, that is not true. Everything is inclusive. All of their courses, every single one, is open to every single student on that campus. And that's part of that continuum of services that they offer through the Inclusive Higher Education Solutions office. And so students are getting a wide variety of mentors, coaching, advising, all different types of course offerings that are, again, offered to everybody. And so that there is never an experience of segregation of any kind on the MSU Denver campus, where students are really learning how to learn. Yes, there is a focus on learning your content area to prepare you for your job, but there's also a really great focus on how to apply skills in authentic ways. So yes, we're applying our skills authentically in our academic environments, and that's a bit more obvious maybe, but also looking at how are we authentically applying our skills in our social environments and in our employment environments and wherever we're living or wherever we hope to live, right? So it's kind of this big, broad look at how do we learn and how do we apply skills in ways that kind of take us from here to there in really seamless pathways. Aspire Scholars at Pikes Peak State College is in Colorado Springs. Like most community colleges, that is a commuter campus, so probably only open to students in the El Paso County area. Students can take Metro Mobility, Uber, drive themselves. You've kind of heard me say all of these things multiple times now, and that's all true at PPSC as well. Now, as a newer, this is their first school year with Aspire Scholars. So as a newer program, I think it's important to put their goal up there, where they say their goal is to empower students to live self-directed lives and transition seamlessly into their communities and professional environments. Now, really, that's kind of the goal of inclusive higher ed as a whole, but I think they summed it up really powerfully, and so I wanted to just put that there for everybody, but also to kind of say that they're really emphasizing students getting internship placements in their 2nd and 3rd years. Again, it's a 3-year option as a community college. And so that's something to keep in mind too, that they are going to have internships and job experiences everywhere, but that is a huge, huge, huge emphasis of Aspire scholars at Pikes Peak. The other unique piece about this school is they are the first college in the state to offer concurrent enrollment. So if you have a student who is in an 18 to 21 transition program, you got to ask your school district if they're participating, because not all are yet. But in some school districts, your student can start taking college courses before they graduate from their transition program. That's helpful for a few reasons. One, the school district pays for it, so it can help defray some costs. Two, your student can get experience on a college campus early. Make sure that's where they want to spend the next few years. So that's a really exciting addition just this school year that they now have. Regis has the Global Inclusive Program. Regis University is a Jesuit university. If you don't know what that means, Jesuit is an order of Catholicism. Really what that means practically is all of students' curriculum really draws on the main areas of care for the whole person, service for others, and contemplation and action. There is no requirement for a student to be Catholic to attend. And in fact, many students are not Catholic, whether they're from the global program or just more general Regis students. That's quite common for students to not be Catholic and go there. Now, the Global Inclusive Program is the most unique model of inclusive higher ed in that they have 4 different options. There's a 1-year option, a 2-year option, a 3-year option, and a 4-year option. Years 1 and 2 are going to be much more focused on liberal arts. So students are taking a wide variety of different types of courses where they're studying things like religion, philosophy, peace and justice, math, right? Where some of those courses might have nothing to do with each other. A basic religion class where, again, it's not a Catholic religion class. They're learning all about different world religions and kinds of things. That might have nothing to do with the basic math class that students take. Right? And so that's kind of the purpose of a liberal arts school, is to expose students to all kinds of different areas of study. With that said, students don't get as much choice because they have to be focused on everything rather than just saying like, I want to be a writer, and so I'm only going to take writing classes or classes that will prepare me to be a writer. So there's kind of that trade-off there. A lot of students live on campus at Regis. Lots of students commute. And again, you've heard me kind of mention those ways of how students might get to campus if they live at home. And the unique piece about, or I should say an additional unique piece about the Global Inclusive Program is that they have trained all their professors to use Universal Design for Learning, or you may have heard UDL, where they are really teaching in a much more inclusive way. So not only are the assignments modified, but the actual teaching itself in some cases changes. Now, just to kind of show you what, as I said, there's the 1-year, the 2-year, the 3-year, and the 4-year, to show you visually what that looks like. There's 3 levels of scaffolded programming, and here's what that looks like. So I'm going to start in that bottom kind of dark green portion down here, where they call this their generalist certificate. If a student only wants to go to college for 1 year, they'll take 18 credits. So that's 9 credits each semester. And at the end of that 1 year, they'll graduate, they'll get a generalist certificate. The vast majority of students at Regis at least go for 2 years, or they will go for this specialist certificate. So at the end of their 2 years, they will have had 36 credits under their belt, which is 9 credits each semester, and they are guaranteed an internship in their 2nd year. Now, let's say a student graduates with their specialist certificate. They can then apply for the career path certificate in the 3rd year. Note, they have to apply for it. This is not an automatic, they can just move on. They have 2 different career paths, which are health professions and communication and advocacy. So a student could do, maybe they're doing health professions in their 3rd year, they finish that, they do 18 more credits, they have an internship at a hospital or something like that. And then they go, you know what, after I've worked in this hospital, I really don't want to have health professions. They can then go for the 4th year, and maybe they're doing communications and advocacy that 2nd time around, getting a different internship in that area, etc. So that's kind of how they get to the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years, where again, Each year has 18 credits or 9 credits per semester. All right, I know I've been talking a lot and we're running up on time, so I promise I'm almost done. UCCS in Colorado Springs has the Office of Inclusive Services. This was the second school in the nation, or second program in the nation, to receive national accreditation, which means they demonstrated a level of quality programming for students with intellectual disability. There are 4 schools in the nation to have this honor. UCCS was the second to get it. Now, they're really focused on starting with a lot of supports freshman year and fading as students prove that they don't need them. And so that is a bit more of a purposeful scaffolding, which does exist everywhere, but it's very, very intentional in the way they make that happen at UCCS. Students can choose to live in housing. They can choose to commute as well. If they want to live at home in the Colorado Springs area, if they do choose to live in housing, they get 6 hours a week of independent living services. If that's not enough for your student, you can pay for more, but you have to pay for it. Now, students can take any course they want at UCCS. They can take courses in any department they want. There is nothing off limits as long as students are taking courses in sequence. And then that kind of third class that I mentioned that they all have that sort of separate class to teach students with ID those targeted skills. At UCCS, they call it college and career. And the way it works there is they have an 8-semester rotating curriculum. In that class, depending on the semester, they're learning things like job skills, executive functioning skills, relationship management, cooking skills, all kinds of things like that. And on top of that, they also have a driving seminar. So if students want to get their driver's license, they can take driver's ed through a class that is directly geared for students with disabilities. Now, this is the first of 2 schools that we've talked about that has an upper age limit. All inclusive higher ed options across the state require students to be at least 18. UCCS says students cannot be any older than 26 at the time when they enroll. That means they'd be 30 when they graduate because it's a 4-year program, but just keep that in mind too. All right, last but not least is UNC Goal in Greeley. So Goal does stand for Go On and Learn, in case you were wondering. Now, all students in Goal live in the same, what they call RLC. They live in the same dorm is basically what that means. That gives them the ability to specifically train their RAs to help meet students' needs so that not only do they have peer mentor support, they also have RA support, and they get all kinds of scaffolded programming in evenings and weekends so that they're not using their kind of downtime in maybe poor ways. Students are fully included across campus in clubs and organizations and events and sports and all the kinds of things. That's also true at other campuses too. Now, we did mention that UCCS has an upper age limit of 26. UNC has an upper age limit of 25, and that's at the time of application, so they can be 26 by the time they enroll. And UNC is the only school in the state that requires students to be their own legal guardian. The reason why is they really want students to lead their own experience and be able to make their own decisions as they develop the skills to do so. So parents are present, but they're more seen as supportive partners. Students exercise their FERPA rights, meaning families are not invited unless students invite them. That's true of meetings, that's true of email chains, you name it. There's a huge focus on accountability, responsibility, self-determination. Students at UNC are required to be a bit more independent than they're required to be at other schools. So if that's something that you're not really sure if that's the right fit for your student, I really highly recommend you schedule a meeting with Christina, who's the director of the Goal program, and just talk to her more about what are your students' skills or needs, what is she expecting or looking for, all that kind of stuff, just so you can kind of have that more realistic conversation from her of how that plays out on the campus. With that said, when you get these slides tomorrow, you can download this just as kind of like a brief look at each of the different schools. This also includes cost breakdowns for this school year. Of course, they go up every year, but just know that there's a range because it depends on if they have a lab fee or, all kinds of different things. So you can look at that. And I know it's already 6 o'clock now. So if you have to go, please do. I'm here as long as you need me. What questions can I answer?